Okay, so some of you might have been in a situation that happens sometimes where you're in a Bible class or a Bible study and you think you're there learning and things are going fine. And then somebody who's had just a little bit of biblical education pipes up and says something about a word you've never interacted with. They might start talking about Gnosticism or something. And occasionally, if you've been in one of these awful moments, you might have heard this person start talking about something related to the Gospels called Q. And suddenly they're talking about this thing called Q, and you feel like, I'm here to study the Bible, not talk about science fiction. What is this thing? And today I want to talk a little bit about this because you may have heard this before, and I've brought in the perfect person to discuss this topic of Q, Dr. Alan Black. And so here's kind of what we want to say, is that Q simply means a sort of source.
Source, yeah.
And are you telling me then that the people who wrote the Gospels used sources?
Yes, the Gospel of Luke seems to say so. Luke begins his Gospel by saying that many had undertaken to write account of the things that happened. And so Luke knew of many sources, and he talks about his own investigation work.
And so those sources could have been Mark, Matthew, and
we kind of run out after
we do.
that because
that's not many.
Everybody I know of, there may be somebody otherwise, but everybody I know of thinks that John was written up in the 90s after the time that Luke would have been written. So he says many, and we have two that he could have used.
Not
that
many.
We know of.
Yeah, so there's an opportunity for additional sources. We're not just suspecting there might be additional sources. There's a reason when we lay the Gospels next to each other to think that Matthew and Luke might be using a source that was not known to Mark.
Yes. Yeah. So if we look at this chart again that we talked about the other day, the chart puts Matthew and Mark and Luke by each other, as you may remember, and it's 35 verses to an inch. And it's color-coded according to the sections. So if it appears in Mark and Matthew or Luke or both, it's in pink. If it appears in only Luke, it's in yellow. If it appears in only Matthew, it's in white, and so forth. Well, Matthew is put over here one additional time for the purpose of comparing Matthew in relation to Luke. And so the material that's in blue is in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And nearly all of that is Sane's material. There's a couple of stories. The temptations, as everyone's familiar with, are very long. We get the details of the temptations in Matthew and Luke. We don't get that in Mark. And the story of the healing of the centurion's servant is found only in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. But most of this is things like the material in the Sermon on the Mount, which in Matthew runs through these three chapters here, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And you can see most of that is blue.
And so if we put this in relational terms, say there's these people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they know each other, and they all sit and talk. And that happens in our friendships. But suppose there's this guy named Q out here. Matthew and Luke are friends with Q. Mark's never met Q.
That's the theory.
And the theory is that.
Theory. Yeah.
And so that they've got together, they chat with Q, they have a similar thing. Mark's out of that relationship, so nothing he would include is there. So to be this Q is just this collection of things that Matthew and Luke have in their Gospels that Mark wouldn't know about.
Yeah. The theory, which we don't have time to get all the support for, is that Mark was the first, and Matthew and Luke both used Mark. But then the argument is made on various grounds that Matthew didn't use Luke and Luke didn't use Matthew. So where did they get all of this blue overlap that is not in Mark? The supposition is that they had something else, either just traditions that were common to them and not known by Mark, or perhaps even a written document.
And so when you say written document, the tradition thing is interesting because there's people who debate, okay, if it's oral, boy, sometimes it kind of looks like it's in the same order or same language.
Right.
Do you favor it being a written source or oral source?
I slightly favor it being a written source.
Slightly?
Slightly,
Okay.
yeah.
So what kind of material? You mentioned a few of the stories that are in there. There are parables. What is the kind of the quality of Q? If somebody picked up Q, which we don't know if we have, how much of it we have. We might have a small percentage or a large percentage. What's in there?
What they would find in there presumably, and like you say, we don't know. This is about 230 verses, and it can be reckoned as a little more or a little less depending on what you really think is parallel. But if they picked up the 230 verses that we could identify as maybe belonging in Q, it would be mostly a sayings collection, a collection of Jesus' teachings, similar to the Sermon on the Mount. And then, of course, Luke has a Sermon on the Plain. But Luke also has some of the other things that are in the Sermon on the Mount. He just has them in different places. Like, for example, the Lord's Prayer. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, but not in Luke's case.
And so as we think about this, this isn't mysterious. This isn't something to be nervous about. This is just that Luke tells us he uses sources, and we look at those. We figure out what material is included, what's not included. There's a scholarly debate, but there's not a lot of sort of subversion going on here. This isn't something we should be nervous about.
No, it's a possible source used by Matthew and Luke that Mark was not aware of. We do know from what Luke says that there must have been such sources. Just like we know Paul wrote a letter to the Laodiceans, and he wrote an early letter to the Corinthians that were missing. We know there were even inspired things by apostles that were not, in God's wisdom, chosen to be kept for our canon. And Q could be one of those. Could even be a collection of Jesus' sayings made by an apostle.
So Q might be one of those things. So here's what we can do for you. That Bible class with that person who always uses the words you don't know, we can't dismiss that person from your class. We can't pull them out of there. You're stuck with them. But next time they talk about Q, you're going to know exactly what they're referring to. I hope this has been helpful to you. We're going to continue offering a few videos and stuff to help clear up some things, but that's all we have for today, and we'll see you next time.
All right.